Hello, welcome. We are here at Intersteno in Cagliari, Italy. With us is Sheryll. We would like to ask you some questions about your profession. So maybe you can introduce yourself, where you're from, and what specifically is your profession.
I'm Sheryll Holley. I am from just north of Cardiff in Wales, United Kingdom. I started my profession originally as a legal secretary, then I had my children, and then I started to note-take with deaf people on a QWERTY keyboard first of all, because I learned typing in school. So I've been typing from the age of 14. So when my children were little, I was looking for something part-time to do, so saw an advert. A local deaf charity had funding, ESF funding, which is European Social Funding, to train note-takers to work with deaf people in the UK. So that's what I did, and I did that for a little while. Years ago, a friend of mine said you'd make a really good stenographer, but at that time I had no idea of how to train or how to get into the profession. But when I was in a local conference, after I trained as a note-taker, note-taking for deaf people, I saw a local stenographer, taking down verbatim in the conference what was being said. And so then I started to research, and then I found a tutor who offered remote training in London. So I signed up for her course, and she gave me the equipment to train, all the lessons, and I started training in the theory that was then called STENED, S-T-E-N-E-D, and it was from America. It was an American-based system. It was on the American stenography keyboard. And I know in the UK you have there is another keyboard called Palantype, which does the same thing, but it's a different theory. So I learned the stenography keyboard, and I slowly got to grips with that, did the theory in about 3 months, and then I started to speed build. So I started learning the keyboard in about the year 2000, and then started from there. I qualified in 2005, and then I started to work with deaf people, and we're all freelance in the UK, and so I signed up with a few agencies and had a few personal contacts because I've been note-taking with deaf people throughout the time, and so that's how I got into stenography.
And what kind of settings or situations do you work for deaf and hard of hearing people? Is it usually in bigger meetings, or is it also one-on-one?
It's a real mix. I do some remote, so I do some university type seminars. I do meetings remotely. I've even done conferences remotely, and I've done a little bit of subtitling remotely as well. But I've also do on-site, and I have a real mix. So sometimes I do remote for a day, and other times I'm traveling the country. So I do annual general meetings for a lot of organisations. I will do conferences. I will do deaf conferences. I've done the odd medical conference, which maybe is not a good idea if you are not given preparation, because they're very, very difficult. But I've worked on site for lots of big things. I think my biggest audience has been about 3,500 on big 40-foot screens, and that was this year, and that was really exciting. So it's a real mix. There's I support people. Sometimes people have deaf and they have sight issues as well as hearing issues. So we need high contrast white text on the black screen, fairly big size, so that they can follow. And so in that situation, sometimes when people are on flip charts taking notes, we have to keep saying, can you describe what's on the flip chart, because my client cannot see what you're writing down, so they have to verbally describe what's going on. So clients who are deafblind, we do staff meetings, we do one-to-ones, I travel regularly in Europe as well as in the UK. Yeah.
And with deaf, blind people, for example, do you adjust, for example, the vocabulary or your speed to them, or is it basically always similar speed and vocabulary that you use?
Lots of clients who come to us tend to like whatever's being said, to be down on paper. So if we can keep up with the speaker within reason, then that's great. And very often we have to say to people, sorry, can you slow down? Because the faster a speaker goes, it's difficult for us to process it, let alone everybody else in the room who has normal hearing. And the faster you go, the less you take in. And I don't think a lot of presenters realise this. If they slow it down, then people will take more interest. Whereas if they're really fast, you come out at the other end of the meeting, it's like, what did he say?
And you also sometimes ask them to repeat something when you don't understand it. Yeah.
Yes.
But that's only in maybe smaller settings, not.
Yes, the big conferences you can't. And even the clients that we work with, sometimes they will realise how fast it's coming, and they will say, sorry, can you please slow down, because my stenographer is struggling, and they have to be really fast in order to say that. And it all depends on how important the information that's coming across. If it's really important, then they might say, sorry, can you slow this down, I'm not getting what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with the text that you produce, do you always give it to the client afterwards, or sometimes, or when they ask for it?
It generally is when we ask for it. So in the UK, there's generally an extra charge for it. But if you're working solely as a note taker in the university settings, then it would be part of your pricing included. But for stenography, when it's staff meetings, conferences, and especially when if it's a big conference and there's two people writing, so we're doing 15 minutes each, then one person would actually put the transcript together, so it's a complete first draft transcript. So yeah.
And how is the system of payment? Is it, for example, if you have an event, organization of the event pays you directly, or is there also, when you work for individuals, some kind of system in the UK for payment there? How does it work?
It depends on who requests the service. So if it's a staff meeting for a local organisation, then there is a government scheme in the UK called Access to Work, and each client will apply to Access to Work for support. So they can get BSL interpreters, British Sign Language interpreters, they can get note takers, they can get stenographers. It all depends on what support they need. They can also get equipment, so if they have back problems they can get a specialist chair, and Access to Work funding will pay for that. And for the clients who need support with BSL interpretation or note taker or stenographer, then they will get a set fund. They will say, right, I have X amount of meetings every year, and so they will get funding for X amount of meetings every year.
But that's only for work related, or
that's for work related. With regards to the conference, so if my client goes to a big conference, legally it's down to the conference organizer to pay if BSL interpreters or note takers, stenographers need to be brought in. They have to make their conference accessible. So the client would apply to go to the conference and say, I'm coming to your conference, I need the support, and the obligation is on the conference organizer then to pay for the support, and they will provide.
Yeah, with the education, if somebody is a student?
With somebody who's a student, there's something called DSA, which is Disabled Students Allowance. So when they apply to go to university, if they have a disability, they can get funding, and very often British Sign Language interpreters are paid for via that method, because you'd need two of them to work alongside a student for the whole year. And the same, generally stenographers aren't really brought in to university settings for younger, or well, any age really, but they're not generally brought in unless it's a real significant loss and their first language is English. they'll probably be offered note takers. It's very rare that stenographers are pulled into a university setting unless you have a client who knows the system and is a more mature student who maybe has been through access to work funding, goes back to university and knows that they can get the funding for, and they can stipulate, I want stenographers. I want in the UK it's called speech to text. So I want a speech to text reporter for my course, and they depending on how forceful they are.
Yeah.
But generally you really have to fight. Even with access to work funding, if it's a very expensive service on a long period of time, they really have to say, you know, and they have to not back down and say, sorry, this is my level of hearing loss, this is what I need, and I'm not settling for anything less.
And leisure settings, or is there nothing?
Leisure settings, it's down to small organisations to fundraise. I know of a couple of organisations who look for grant funding, so if they have special events they will try and raise some, they will write out to different charities and say, I'm doing this conference, I would like to make my conference accessible, can you help me with funding?
Yeah, but I also mean, for example, going to a wedding or also the doctor or a job interview, small things like that. Something there, or is that note takers who do that?
It's a mix. If you have doctors, there is generally the National Health Service have an agency that they get interpreters and note takers through. So they apply through the agency. It's part of the NHS funding in the UK. But if somebody has a hearing loss or needs BSL interpretation, then they would actually say, they would say to their GP or consultant, you know, I need this support for this hospital appointment, and then it's up to the GP consultant to contact the NHS agency, which is being contracted by the National Health Service, because they have to go through set channels.
And with regards to training, you said you have the American system and you got remote training. What is the situation like in the UK now for training of stenographers or pallant typists? Is there anything or?
No, there is remote training from home. That's your only option.
For both systems?
For both systems,
okay.
Yeah. If you can get hold of the pallant type system, and I think probably you're better off interviewing one of the pallant typists with regard to their system, because I learned stenography. But generally, there are training materials out there. So you have to learn the basics. And so if you can get hold of the pallant type basics, then you could do that, and then you could speed build the same as I did. But there are, as far as I'm aware, there are some more online courses now from the States that you can sign on to. But obviously the time difference would be quite difficult. If I was learning now, that's probably what I would be looking to do. But it's very, very expensive. This is what puts people off. The funding to get the machines, I mean, you're talking a basic machine, £2,000. The software to run it is £3,000, although there is Plover, I'm not sure how you say it, on the market now, which is free open source software. So you can get a basic setup, and if you go for a second-hand machine, you can get up and running. But to do a professional job, I'm of the opinion, because I've seen how much it helps, go for a good software that has got all the bells and whistles on it, that you can actually make your life a lot easier with it.
Yeah. And as regards to the skills of people who do this job, what would you say should be the skills or the competences or motivation maybe of going into this profession? What kind of person should you be? A lot
of stenographers in the UK and people I've met doing the same job are musicians. So piano players, guitar players, saxophone, flute, you know, anything. If you're used to doing the mechanics, so doing multiple keystrokes, regardless of whether it's on a musical instrument or whether it's on a piano or keyboard, you have to be able to It's like that tapping your head and rolling rubbing your belly, you know, that kind of thing. You have to try and coordinate. Coordination, that's the word I'm looking for. You have to be coordinated. So I'm not a dancer, but I can coordinate my hands. And so those are the skills. But you have to also be good with people, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there. The work is not going to come to you. You have to get the right contacts, so you have to put yourself out there.
And are all the professionals in the UK independent, self-employed, or are they part of a bigger organization, or is there anything like an organization that's supporting them?
I would say 90% of us are self-employed, freelance. Yeah, I think there are one or two employed people, but generally the work is so varied that you're always working for different organisations. So you can work through agencies, so they'll send out job adverts, and then it's up to you whether you respond. If it's local to you, you can say, yes, I'm available on this date to cover this job.